Hi y'all, it's Liz. Welcome back. If you're new here, I'm glad you could make it. By way of a refresher, I'm currently working through one book a week in 2022, and I'm sharing my experience of it here on YouTube. Anyone interested in jumping in with me is more than welcome to. In fact, I encourage it as I live to have great conversations with interesting people about interesting topics. For those of you who would like to read with me but don't want to buy a bunch of books this year, I've placed my reading list and links to any electronic copies of my selections that I could find in the description below. So this week I read Mary Shelley's famous work, Frankenstein, or the modern-day Prometheus. It's a fascinating journey through the minds and mechanics of what it means to be human. Let's jump in then, shall we? Before we get started, if you would like and subscribe, that would be lovely. And as always, feel free to visit me on my Instagram to get a peek into my life behind the books. If nothing else, you'll get a chance to see my Boston Terrier Gracie in action as she opens up packages for me on New Book Day. So in recent days, the authorship of many novels written by females during the Regency, Romantic, and Victorian periods have been called into question. Most notably are the works of Jane Austen, whose brilliance was downplayed by Professor Catherine Sutherland a few years ago. After looking at 1,100 of Austen's handwritten manuscripts, Sutherland claimed that Austen was far from being the perfect stylist. In fact, Sutherland credited most of the brilliance of Austen's prose to one man in particular, William Guilford, and to others who had edited her work. So what does this have to do with Mary Shelley's work? Well, it seems that yet another academic is claiming that Shelley's work was actually written by one of her male family members. This claim has been made by a retired market research analyst known as John Larston. Larston took a dive into the literary world in 2007 and came up with a three-part thesis which stated that, first, Frankenstein was often misinterpreted, second, that the real author was actually Percy Shelley, and third, that the plot of Frankenstein centered chiefly around romantic male friendship. While there's no denying that the third component to his thesis might have some merit, or that the first part of the thesis is vague enough to be researched and argued in any number of ways, the second aspect of his thesis falls apart under real academic scrutiny. Take, for instance, the way that the narrators of the piece speak in long-winded paragraphs. This has been pointed out by many literary critics as being demonstrative of an inexperienced writer. The lack of full-body descriptions when it comes to climactic action speaks to inexperience as well. There is also the fact that Frankenstein seems to take on more of a motherly role when it comes to the creature. This can be seen in his unwillingness to destroy his creation until the very end, and in how he continually sympathizes with the creature's plight until the creature kills Elizabeth. And if nothing else clues you into the fact that Mary Shelley did indeed write Frankenstein, the fact that Victor Frankenstein continually feels faint and feverish when placed under stress ought to. Think back to the many times that Laura and Anne felt feverish and faint under stress in Wilkie Collins' The Woman in White, and you will see what I mean. For all of the flaws in Larston's thesis, the idea that Frankenstein is about male companionship does seem to be a legitimate angle to read this work from. This becomes evident right from the start, where the reader finds Robert Walton asserting that he bitterly feels the want of a friend, and is in great need of a friend who would have the sense enough not to despise him as romantic and affectionate enough for him to endeavor to regulate his mind. Consider, too, that when Victor Frankenstein crosses Walton's path and tells Walton all about the macabre things he's done, Walton's not repulsed. Instead, Walton's affections are deepened in much the same way that a lover's affections are deepened each time his or her companion shares a deep, dark secret about themselves. Perhaps this is part of Larston's thesis that rings the truest because it is the component of the story that speaks most directly to his own interest as a person and a critic. Larston is, after all, an advocate for gay rights and an open homosexual. The fact that Larston is able to connect in this way with the piece of the writing that is over 200 years old speaks to its timelessness. There is something else in the narrative that keeps Frankenstein relevant to the modern-day reader as well. This is its subject matter, which deals directly with two of the biggest realities of life that we all encounter, monsters and the fear of death. Anyone who says that they don't fear monsters or death is a liar. The monsters may not be 8 feet tall and be stitched together from the corpses of others, but monsters are indeed real. Some of these monsters are our parents, siblings, toxic family members, bosses, or fellow employees. There are also the monsters of alcohol or drug addiction, which can plague human beings and consume our lives. And at other times, these monsters reside in our own heads in the form of depression, anxiety, overthinking, perfectionism, or imposter syndrome. The point is that we all have something to fear regardless of the confidence that most of us project outwardly. All of us fear death as well, and it is this fear which we see in Victor Frankenstein as he attempts to overcome it by creating the monster. It is not by chance that the monster is created after Victor loses his mother. She dies, and he changes his entire focus of his studies. What Victor quickly learns, though, is that playing God is very, very dangerous and a horrible idea. Victor's attempt to play God could be read as a critique on materialism, defined as relating to the theory that nothing exists except matter and its movement and modifications. This is what Mary Shelley relies on as she allows Victor to reanimate dead corpses through the use of science. This becomes clear when you look at the text and realize that Victor only ever refers to the body parts he's stitching together as the materials needed. He never clearly articulates that he has stitched together pieces of various corpses, but the reader clearly understands it nonetheless. This use of materialistic philosophy and the fact that Victor Frankenstein continually refers to himself as a natural scientist and chemist of sorts is what critics point to as they claim that Frankenstein is the first sci-fi novel. Incidentally, this materialistic approach to the human body is what many cryogenic scientists rely on to some degree to sell their wares in today's world. And this approach to life and death is also what many a zombie writer has relied on from William Seabrook's 1929 novel The Magic Island onward. No one should be surprised that Shelley uses materialism in her work, given that she has hinted to the Greek origins of her story in the title of the piece. Materialism finds its origin in the 5th century Greek philosophy that reemerged with the work of Karl Marx in the 19th century. The story of Prometheus also dates back to the 7th and 8th century in Greece, and like Prometheus, who gives the sacred fire of Mount Olympus to mankind, Victor Frankenstein has gifted mankind the secret behind creation and immortality. Both have disastrous consequences. There's no denying that what Victor Frankenstein does is macabre. The macabre is what makes for good Gothic novels, though. Indeed, Gothic fiction identifies itself with a style of writing that is characterized by elements of fear, horror, death, and gloom. Gothic novels also have a touch of Romanticism to them, which is what we find in the love story between Victor and Elizabeth, and perhaps between Victor and Robert Walton. Romance can also be found in the diction that Mary Shelley uses, as her word choice is sometimes indicative of the Enlightenment period which preceded the publication of Frankenstein. This writing style has been termed Romanticism, and it is a literary movement which bridges the gap between Victorian literature and the Regency period literature of Jane Austen. Like Oscar Wilde's diction used in his story The Picture of Dorian Gray, which was published the latter part of the 19th century, the writing style that Mary Shelley is using in Frankenstein demonstrates a nod to the past with an eye to the future. When looking at the writing produced through the 19th century in and around England, there's also a touch of the macabre to be found. This displays itself in the ghostly apparitions in the works of Henry James and Charles Dickens. It can be seen in the horrid painting that Oscar Wilde's work puts forth in Dorian Gray, and it's seen in Wilkie Collins' work as he flirts openly with it, presenting Anne Catherick as a ghostly figure who lurks around graveyards and seems obsessed with the past and those who are dead. Shelley takes a more open approach to it, though, with the monster, as did Robert Louis Stevenson in his story The Body Snatcher. Given that Frankenstein was written over 200 years ago, it may be hard for some to find it relevant in terms of modern-day problems. A deep read of the piece reveals why it's considered to be a classic, though. For all of Shelley's overly philosophical proselytizing, there really is a message for each reader who picks up the novel. For Larsson, this was the theme of male companionship that spoke to him. For others, the adventure in the story of the race to the North Pole speaks the loudest. There's also the feminist read, which places Victor in the role of mother to the creature. The feminist read speaks to the strengths and intelligence that women possessed, even as Regency and Victorian society saw them as emotionally and physically fragile. This type of read requires that you admit that a woman actually wrote Frankenstein, though, and that Victor is a projection of the author onto the page. There are 3 other ways to apply this work to modern-day life as well. One is by looking at it as a glimpse into megalomania. Another is by looking at Frankenstein as an environmentalist novel, and there's also a cautionary tale regarding evolution if you look closely. You don't have to look very far in today's world to find a megalomaniac. These are people who are obsessed with the exercise of power, especially if it allows them to dominate others. In this instance, Jeff Bezos and Mark Zuckerberg, along with their pal Elon Musk, come to mind. What do these men have in common with the men that existed in Mary Shelley's time? For starters, their hunger for money and their lust for power. Indeed, Shelley was writing during the Industrial Revolution. This was a time of great scientific and technological advancement. It was also a time of great political and social upheaval. To put it plain, the world was in transition, and that left a great many people scared and confused about what the future would hold. When populations become scared and confused, they are more likely to relinquish their worldviews and rights to anyone who can offer them a simple solution to their everyday problems. Enter the megalomaniac. Bezos offers consumerism to cure what ails the world. Zuckerberg offers escapism that encourages consumerism, and Musk is all about projecting power and elitism as a way to control the world around himself. When compared to Shelley's time, Bezos, Zuckerberg, and Musk represent the industrialists who got rich at the expense of others in the latter part of the 18th and the early part of the 19th century. Like these 19th century industrialists, Bezos, Zuckerberg, and Musk have unleashed their goods and services onto the world and take no responsibility for the trouble that these things have caused. This seems a bit like Victor Frankenstein, who let the monster loose on society and claims to be guiltless as he complains about the woes while taking no responsibility for his part that he played in causing them. A theme of environmentalism can also be seen when examining Frankenstein. This is most evident in how Robert Walton and his crew attempt to tame the frozen wilderness. That wilderness resists again and again, though, which eventually forces Walton and his crew to retreat. The lesson here is that when you push nature too far, it will always push back. Victor's endeavors also end in revolt, as when he makes a breakthrough in the natural science of creation, his creation revolts against him. Here, there is a hint of Shelley's commentary on evolution as well, in that the monster can withstand elements that would kill a fragile human being. The monster is thus a new species created by man, which eventually poses a danger to man when pushed too far. Is Frankenstein a cautionary tale against cloning, designer babies, and biochemical warfare? Is it a tale of how when you push nature too far, it will eventually push back? You be the judge. As interesting as Frankenstein was, it's time to move on. I will be cramming in one last novel with my remaining time in January. This is my bonus read of Bram Stoker's Dracula. I will also be bringing you my first coffee cup confessional as I wrap up my reading experience for January 2022 and move on to my new reading list for February. That will be its own video that is also coming soon. Until then, take care, y'all.